Greetings, Bill Mobley from UCSD Neuroscience is here on the next edition of On Our Mind, and I'm here with Patricia Churchland, who's professor of philosophy here at UCSD. And I've had a chance to take a look and really to enjoy a recent book that she's written. The title of the book is Touching a Nerve, the Self as Brain, and I thought we might begin our interview, Patricia. Welcome.
Thank you.
By really reading for our listeners from the first paragraph. My brain and I are inseparable. I am who I am because my brain is what it is. Even so, I often think about my brain in terms different from those I use when thinking about myself. I think about my brain as that and about myself as me. I think about my brain as having neurons, but I think of me as having a memory. Still, I know that my memory is all about the neurons in my brain. Lately, I think about my brain in more intimate terms as me. A beautiful beginning to a very lovely book. Patricia, welcome. Tell us about,
Thank you, Bill.
Tell us about your brain and you.
Well, you know, neuroscience, especially over the last several decades, has developed to a point where we can really begin to see these links between high-level concepts like the self or like memory and basic neurobiological concepts having to do with individual neurons and how they function. And I mean, this is a very new time in history of science and in the history of humans understanding themselves in neurobiological terms. And I find that absolutely amazing.
A new paradigm, really.
It is a new paradigm. And in some ways, the old paradigm may weave in with the new. In some ways, it's going to fall apart. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, but what we are discovering about the brain is so important, how we think about ourselves and how we think about how we connect to other people.
How does a farm girl become a philosopher?
Well, you know, these things are always full of luck and chance and funny decisions made when you don't know what else to do. And I started in philosophy, I think, because I really thought that philosophy was going to address questions about the nature of the mind, and that it would allow us to make progress on the nature of how we acquire knowledge about the world, how we think, how we reason. And then I realized that philosophy, as it's practiced in the 20th century, really isn't about the nature of things, that largely it was about the nature of words. And so once I was in graduate school, I sort of began a shift from the way philosophy is practiced to kind of reaching back into the tradition of Aristotle and Hume and Kant, to asking those kinds of questions, but asking them in the context of this new developing framework in neuroscience and, of course, psychology as well.
And you were influenced by Aristotle, a naturalist, Aristotle. How do you compare the Plato story to the Aristotle story? These two men who were linked
Indeed.
as the most prominent philosophers of that age.
Indeed.
How are they different, and how has the Aristotelian doctrine moved farther along than the Platonic doctrine?
Well, Plato, of course, had these really rather mystical ideas about things, that the nature of knowledge was somehow having a relationship to this very abstract realm where, by virtue of how the intellect works, we reach into that realm and we grasp those truths. Now, Aristotle was Plato's student, and Aristotle, I think, because he grew up in a very practical family, his father was a physician, and because I think he realized that there was much to be discovered by looking at the nature of things and making observations. Even though he was Plato's student, and of course, Plato was such a grand, powerful figure, Aristotle really took things in a very different direction. And although, you know, he made some observations or made some claims about the nature of things that turned out to be wrong, at least he saw that observation, test, experiment, generating naturalistic hypotheses was the way to go.
So seeing is such an important part of science. I mean, the story of the nervous system is really one of the evolution of thought in concert with technology.
Yes.
It's all of science, true,
Yes,
but certainly for the brain. The idea that you discover something about the brain enlightens your ability to interpret what the brain does, and that issue of technology and concept of tool and idea very much go hand in hand. So is that, where do we go with this now? Where are we now in the tool concept dialogue?
That is, of course, a very beautiful point, that there is this kind of coevolution between technology and science. And, sometimes people say, well, why did it take neuroscience so long to get started? And of course, the answer is that you needed a whole lot of physics and a whole lot of chemistry. And in particular, you needed the understanding of electricity, which we really didn't have until Faraday. You needed all that in place in order to make any sense of the brain. But then the question that you're asking is, so what kinds of technologies are going to, or do we in our wildest dreams hope will take us into the future? And of course, as you know, I think one of the great hopes of this brain mapping project, behind which Obama has put his weight, is that we will find ways of accessing a very particular level, and that's the level between the level of the single cell and the level of the system. That's the level of the circuit. How do we identify circuits? What exactly is it that circuits do that allow me to see a shape or to recognize a face or to smell a smell or make a decision? Because that's a circuit level property.
Sounds like a very neuroscientific way of thinking about the brain.
Yeah.
But let me go back to the fact that you're a professor of philosophy. And so let me read from your book again. I began to learn neuroscience in the mid-1970s after having begun a career in philosophy. This transition was motivated by the realization that if mental processes are actually processes of the brain, then you can't really understand the mind without understanding how the brain works. And then you talk about your husband, Paul, and you say, to the exasperation of many of our philosophical colleagues, we pursued the idea that the nature of consciousness, language use, thought, and feelings would be illuminated by understanding the brain. How upsetting for your colleagues. Talk about that and the responses to you, and actually how this impacted the development of your career as a philosopher.
Yes, I mean, it was very interesting to me because many colleagues in philosophy, both where we were in Winnipeg but also in America, didn't think there was a non-physical soul. So I thought, they will agree with me that you need to understand the nature of the brain, which is, after all, the thing that's performing these functions. But it wasn't like that. What they felt was that psychology was okay, because you could understand behavior and interpret behavior. But neuroscience would never tell you anything about the nature of thought or reasoning or how it is that we compose sentences in language, how we make decisions. And that what we were doing, what Paul and I were doing, was just ridiculous. And I found that very shocking at the time, but it's still true, unfortunately, of many philosophers, that they find ways of saying neuroscience isn't really relevant. It's very nice of you to be interested, but it's not really going to tell us, it's not going to address the nature of higher functions.
So, but for me, there's only two options to understand that. The first option is it isn't in the brain. It isn't really going to be in the brain that we find the answers to the greatest questions of the human mind. The other is, gosh, you guys are working at the single cell level, and quite frankly, we're at a very different level, and we guess that the human mind will never be able to truly decipher the human mind. Which of those two options does it turn out to be, or is it both?
Well, I think those are kind of the two options, but you know, I was greatly influenced by Francis Crick in many ways, because he, by the time the mid-1980s rolled around, he was so interested in neuroscience. And one of the things that, the observation that he often made was that you can't tell by looking at a problem whether or not it's solvable. So when philosophers said, you'll never be able to understand the nature of meaning in language, for example, he'd say, how can they know? I mean, it's not like problems come from Plato's heaven saying, you're never going to solve me empirically, so how would you know? And I think that's...
It's a very philosophical question, actually.
It's a very philosophical question. And so I think that for many questions that philosophers want to take to themselves and say, only we can really plumb the nature of the phenomenon, and neuroscience will never do it, you think, how could they know? Especially if they are innocent of what we do know in neuroscience. I mean, if that's all sort of terra incognita to them, how could they know that neuroscience could never advance to tell us about the nature of decision-making and whether or not free will is something that we genuinely in normal conditions have? But of course, the other part of it is we can't tell either, because it's the brain, as you of course know better than I, that the brain is so complex and there's so many bits and pieces and it's so dynamical, and the same circuit, depending on what individual neurons, will do one thing and then will do another. It may be really hard. On the other hand, I think what the last 15 or 20 years have told us is that some of the discoveries are such as to tell us something about the basic principles of the way things get done in nervous systems. And that, of course, is terribly important.
And the complexity is there, but there's nothing that says the complexity is impenetrable.
No.
And in fact, the tools we have, it seems to me, are giving us more and more insight.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a biology teacher in the Outback who used to tell us that life was a special force and that you could never, ever hope to explain the nature of living. I mean, he was a vitalist.
Yeah.
You could never explain the nature of livingness in terms of dead molecules. How could you get livingness itself out of the very dead molecule? Blah, blah, blah. And I think many of the arguments about consciousness, for example, that we hear, you can never explain the nature of what it is to see blue or to smell cinnamon. Maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we know that?
It's a lovely position to take that a priori, we've just got a lot of great questions and not too many answers, but that those questions are highly motivating.
Yeah.
We may never answer those questions, but to presume that they aren't worth being asked is very unscientific.
Yes, it's very unscientific.
Now I have got to ask you a question. Having talked about the brain and having great love for the brain, I suppose one question that we have to ask is, are we ready to say that neuroscience is going to trump philosophy, is going to make it irrelevant? Are all of the wonders of the philosophical construction, are all those wonderful things that we learn about what it is to be a good human, are those things that are going to be readily reduced to, oh, it's this circuit operating in this way?
Well, you know, it kind of depends on what the philosophical question is. If the question is, say, about the nature of reasoning and decision-making, then I think that neuroscience hand-holding with psychology is where the greatest progress is likely to be made. On the other hand, I think there, of course, always are questions about the nature of living a life. But there, I'm not so sure that philosophers have anything very special to contribute. That is, I think there are many people with considerable wisdom, both within the academy, but also outside of the academy. And in some ways, the problem of how to lead a good life has been addressed many, many times, and the answers are basically essentially the same. You need family and love and meaningful or satisfying work. And Aristotle said that, and what's his name, Dr. Phil on TV says that, and then everybody else in
we more or less agree.
Between. And we do more or less agree. Now, exactly how to find meaningful work, well, sometimes you need to have, some advice from people, but those are the things that make life worthwhile.
Is there a risk to knowing too much about the brain? Does brain knowledge make everything else secondary? Does knowing the brain open up possibilities that we don't want to look at?
It's possible, but I don't see it yet. I mean, I think, for example, in the domain of psychiatry, where we really still do not understand schizophrenia, which afflicts 1% of the population. And this is a young person's disease. And I think, there's a sense in which you could romanticize schizophrenia, I guess, if you had a mind to. But from my perspective, there's nothing romantic about it. It's tragic, it's devastating, and to have insight into that disease so that we could intervene seems to me to be something devoutly to be desired. So when I think about neurological disorders, that tends to be the way I feel about it. But I also think, you might ask the same thing with regard to molecular biology. I mean, are there genes that we'd be better off not knowing about rather? It hasn't really turned out that way.
My guess is that knowledge is something to be much appreciated and something to be pursued. There can be limits on how we're able to apply our knowledge.
Absolutely.
But to deny the value of knowledge for its own sake would be a huge mistake.
I think it would be a huge mistake, and I think it's always better to know than to not know, even if at first it makes you uncomfortable. Usually there are ways then of dealing with the discomfort, which normally has to do with worrying about the implications of that knowledge. But humans regulate those things, and by and large we do not too bad a job.
One of the worries that, one of the issues that are raised when we think about the brain and the mind, the brain is the organ of the mind, and mind and soul are tied up with one another, and how do we sort that out? I loved in the book the question, does the idea of the soul really deserve to be shelled? Might we have a soul as well as a brain? And then toward the end of that section, we can't be certain that no distinct soul science will ever flower. But as things stand, brain science seems to have the leg up on soul science.
It does.
I love the idea that one doesn't discount a whole new branch of science, but that one centers one's ability to make observations very firmly in the brain, waiting for new discoveries, new tools, new concepts to emerge. Your thoughts?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that it was probably would have seemed possible, say at the turn of the 19th century, to have a soul science where the idea was you would explain thinking and perceiving and understanding and so forth in terms of this non-physical thing. But it never happened. And I think it didn't happen because it probably isn't a real thing. And but I say probably because, we do have to be open-minded about these things in science, and we do have to be prepared for surprises. But at the moment, it looks as implausible as the idea that, there are fairies or that there is vital spirits. Doesn't look like that happens.
Patricia Churchland, a great pleasure being with you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us on Our Mind.